Hello, I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about sleep monitoring devices. Are they worthwhile or not? So I'll be talking for about 20 minutes. If you have questions at the end or during the session, you can type them in. I'll get to them at the end, or you can send in questions later when this is posted on YouTube and Facebook. So as usual, I'll start with the take-home message. And the take-home message is there's a plethora of devices out there to help you monitor your sleep, and none of them provide the accuracy that conventional polysomnography provides. But what's really important, I think, is trying to figure out what question you are trying to answer. And if you are careful about what you ask for, they may be helpful to you. And if not, these devices, monitoring systems, can add to anxiety, which is exactly the last thing you want for insomnia. So I'll be getting back to that. So I can start with insomnia and problems of sleep, which are really, we are sleepwalking through an age of insomnia. Recent surveys in America suggest that at least 70% of Americans have trouble falling asleep once a month, but a full quarter of Americans are getting inadequate sleep at least half the nights, and as many as, I've lost track of the statistics now, 10% of people, Americans, are having trouble with sleeping virtually every night. So this is a big common problem, problems with sleep. There's certainly lots of social factors behind this because the rates keep increasing and our biology hasn't changed that much. And so the tech industry has seen a need and has created a wealth of devices to try to meet that or help us, or maybe just to sell product and not help us. So deprivation of sleep or lack of sleep is clearly tied into why do we need sleep to begin with. And for years, we've been aware of things like, daytime alert. So a whole night of sleep deprivation is roughly equivalent in terms of mental impairment to being legally drunk. So alertness is lower the next day, ability to recall information, ability to compute or do simple addition or word finding problems is equally impaired. So clearly a good night's sleep is important for functioning the next day. We've also learned over the last half century, as we've identified different stages of sleep, that non-REM sleep seems to be particularly important for helping consolidate memories and also for selectively forgetting what we don't need to remember, and that REM sleep seems to be particularly helpful for integrating new experiences into worldviews. And we've also identified just in the last decade that one function of sleep seems to be to allow the garbage collection system to flush the garbage out of our brain. And that flushing actually involves increasing the space between neurons, flooding it with cerebrospinal fluid, and literally rinsing things through the system. And when that rinsing is going on, again, normal connectivity is somewhat impaired. It's not torn off apart, but it's a very different biological milieu, and it's hard to imagine the brain functioning the same way with that volume of fluid flushing through it as it would during an awake alert state. So sleep's important, and for decades we've had what's called traditional polysomnography. So poly, many, sleeps, somno, and graphy, a drawing or picture of what's going on during sleep. So we had sleep studies which did traditional polysomnography, and they were collecting a wealth of information. So usually more than 20 electrodes flowing from the head, at least six, can I do the math? Six, measuring the EEG electroencephalogram from different parts of the brain to look at the frequency and amplitude of electrical activity throughout the brain. 2 leads on the eyelids to measure the electrooculogram to look at eye movement. Usually at least 3 leads to measure EMG, electromyograph, so electrical muscle activity, usually one on the chin and one on either leg. And part of the leg was to look for restless leg movements and others. Usually a few leads to look at an EKG or electrocardiogram, heart rate and heart rhythm, and usually also a pulse oximeter to measure oxygenation of the blood, usually a band around the abdomen measuring a plethysmography band to measure abdominal pressure, and may or may not include devices to measure nasal pressure, and sound devices to measure another aspect of the force of exhalation or inhalation. And part of all that elaborate research, or elaborate wealth of information that's being gathered, allowed people to look at one, sort of sleep latency, how long it took someone to fall asleep after they were instructed to go to sleep. Two, the total duration of sleep. Three, the efficiency of sleep. So within the span of time you were sleeping or trying to sleep, how much of it you were actually sleeping. And then a fairly finely detailed assessment of how much time you're spending in different stages of sleep, including REM sleep, including wakefulness, including slow wave sleep, both the shallow stages 1, 2, and then deep stages of sleep. And for most people, it's not a precise like clockwork, but a sloppy 90-minute clock. So we usually go through about 4 to 6 cycles within our sleep of cycling through wakefulness, but our eyes are closed, so usually you're not aware of being wakeful, REM sleep, and shallow stages of slow sleep to deep sleep. Sorry, usually the REM sleep's after the slow wave sleep. So with polysomnography, we could show a wealth of information about different stages of sleep. But the interesting thing is that more than 90% of polysomnography for years has been done to detect one simple condition, and that's sleep apnea. Now, sleep apnea is quite a common condition. The recent estimates are that more than 1 billion people on the planet have clinically significant sleep apnea. So sleep apnea, although it's happening during sleep, is more of a breathing problem. So apnea is absence of breath. A breathing problem that's happening during sleep, and why we're seeing it in such abundance these days is that the two biggest risk factors for sleep apnea are obesity, which has grown considerably worldwide over the last several decades, and aging. So we have an increasingly aging population. Historically, most humans died fairly young in their life, and now most people are living substantially longer. So we're seeing percentage of population, much greater percentage in the elderly range. So interestingly, even though we had this really elaborate system for collecting lots of data, there's a trend recently to most of that's actually the data being collected is irrelevant to sleep apnea, not completely irrelevant, but not necessarily necessary for either diagnosing it or monitoring its progress. And essentially what you want to know is what's going on breathing with oxygenation. And that can be done with much simpler devices and setups without the EEG, without most of the muscle recording. So there's actually a trend both for financial reasons and access reasons to use less standard polysomnography. So again, we have this sort of gold standard, and when I started seeing devices, whether they're rings, whether they're watches, whether they're apps on the phone to measure sleep, and patients started getting excited about this almost a decade ago, I kept pointing out to them that even though some of them were pretending to not 3 decimal point, but you're sleeping 27.4% of your night in a REM stage and others, there are home systems that that do use electrodes to measure your EEG, that do measure the brainwave amplitude and frequency during the night, and can, as precisely as traditional polysomnography, assign what sleep stage you are on at what interval. Those devices tend to cost 500 and up, and there's ongoing costs for new electrode covers or connectors each regularly. So I'm not going to talk too much about those. I'm talking more about the apps, the rings, the watches, the wearables that are being advertised as measuring your sleep accurately. So what these devices do, most of them are using some form of an accelerometer, so just measuring how quick movement detectors, using that to estimate what stage of sleep someone's in. Some of them are combining that accelerometer information with heart rate data, which can give us a more accurate assessment of what stage someone's in. So again, during REM sleep, the body's paralyzed except for eye movements. Those are going on. The brain waves in REM sleep look pretty similar, mostly beta waves to an awaking person. In non-REM sleep, body isn't paralyzed, so there is some movement, and the frequency and amplitude of the waves, essentially frequency wavelength increases and amplitude of waves, so you're getting bigger, slower waves as you get into deeper sleep. So most of these current devices are not particularly detecting with great accuracy what stage of sleep you're in. They may offer numbers that look highly detailed, but they are crude measurements, again, usually relying on movement, which is just one aspect of what's going on. On the other hand, studies indicate that if you are consistent with the device and looking at your own patterns, they are fairly useful for detecting changes in your own patterns over time. Again, whether at any point in time they're actually particularly accurate in terms of what stage you're in, they can certainly help you show or detect trends. So again, I maybe didn't say, so with traditional polysomnography, most of what was being ordered, these tests are being tested for, was to rule out or rule in sleep apnea. More than 90% of the time, that's what these sleep studies found. Lower amounts of narcolepsy, parasomnias, most of the other problems of sleep. Polysomnography wasn't traditionally used for someone who just had insomnia or trouble falling asleep. So these newer devices, which again are more limited in terms of detecting the accuracy of what stage you're in, are actually primarily geared for a completely different problem than sleep apnea. They're geared towards insomnia. And again, I started with the statistics. Insomnia is a big problem. And what I consider the biggest finding, although I'd say it's tied with the discovery of the garbage collection system of the brain that is only active not just during sleep, but is also set by the circadian clock. So it gets back to, for decades, we've had almost, I would argue, the same amount of wealth of data. We hear so much about the duration of sleep's important. You need to get 8 hours, you need to get 8 hours, you need to get 8 hours. We've known for decades that it's not just 8 hours, you need the same 8 hours. Because if you're used to sleeping from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and the weekend comes along and you stay up till 2 a.m. binge watching your favorite show and sleep from 2 till 10 a.m., you are not going to be feeling the same amount of restedness. You're not going to be alert to the same extent. You got the same 8 hours, you got the same duration, but you are not in the same place. You are not as well rested because, again, there are both duration effects important for sleep and circadian rhythm effects that are important for sleep. So I was getting back to garbage systems employed during sleep at sleep at the normal time. That's important, but I'd say the more, even bigger finding in the last decade plus is that almost all the problems of sleep aren't problems of sleep. Huh? What am I talking? I'm not talking about breathing problems, pulmonary problems like sleep apnea. What I'm talking about is the research that reminds us we have two different systems. We have a sleep system, we have a wakefulness system. Usually they are mutually exclusive. So when our wake system's alert, sleep goes down. When sleep turns on, awakeness turns off. More than 95% of problems with sleep are not a failure of that sleep system. The sleep system's there. It's waiting to kick in. The problem is with our arousal system, and the problem is that it's locked into stay on and be aroused. And recent data suggests that most people who have problems with insomnia have measurable signs of overarousal throughout the day, not just late at night, not just before they're about to go to sleep, but throughout the day. There are electrophysiological and brainwave measures that they are over-aroused. Why is that important? That's important in helping get people to sleep, is that your goal isn't to force sleep to happen, which many of our sleep pills are good at doing. Your goal is really to damp down arousal and let sleep naturally encroach or appear or emerge. And that trying to force yourself to sleep, force the situation, is actually one way of increasing arousal and makes it more difficult. So getting back to all these devices, I have, and again, this is a clinical population. It may not represent how people are using these in the world at large, but I have had many people coming to me obsessing that I thought I slept well last night, and my sleep monitor says I got 20% less REM sleep and 13% less slow wave sleep. And then they're fretting about it all day, and they're wondering what they did wrong. So if your sleep monitor system is adding to daytime arousal, if you're getting more anxious from it than you're being soothed by it, it's having a net negative effect. So the other thing to mention is that some of these systems are just simple monitoring systems. Increasingly, many of them aren't just monitoring systems or giving you feedback systems. They can also provide information and guidance. And what they're actually guiding on is a review of good sleep hygiene. So I will dash through good sleep hygiene in a minute or two. So again, if you are using your device in a way that's helping reinforce good sleep hygiene, great. If it's making you more upset or anxious, then don't use it. So basics of good sleep hygiene. One is duration is important. Most adults really need close to 8 hours. If you're below 7, it's probably not enough. And the timing is every bit as important as the duration. So within an hour or so, you should stick to the same bedtime. And that includes weekdays and weekends as well. The other factors that are important, keeping your room dark enough. And that's particularly the disruptor in our modern lives tends to be the light from our televisions, watches, phones, electrical devices. It's particularly the blue end of light that the circadian clock responds to. So many of our systems now have blue wave blocking devices. That's helpful, but whole spectrum light is disruptive to the clock, makes it harder to fall asleep. You also want to keep it quiet. So noise is a big addition to the arousal system, making it harder to fall asleep. You want to keep it cool enough. Usually body temperature is already dropping before you go to sleep to prepare you for sleep. Body temperature actually starts kicking up, going up in the morning a few hours before you wake up to make you more prepared and ready for the day. Keeping exercise during the daytime is good, but you don't want it in the last 2 hours before sleep, probably because the most detrimental effect there is because it's increasing core temperature. And you don't want that. There's sort of some paradoxical evidence that a warm bath increases peripheral temperature and actually helps decrease core temperature. So that for some people may be a helpful solution. And again, you want to avoid things that are disruptive to sleep, particularly alcohol and caffeine are both disrupting deeper stages of sleep. So If you are using a device to monitor your sleep, one, take the figures you have as with a grain of salt. They may not accurately be parsing your sleep completely accurately, but if you keep with the same system and you're noticing trends over time, that's probably meaningful and helpful data. And if the device is making you more agitated, upset, aroused, worried than it's helping, don't use it. That's about all I have for today. I'm not seeing any questions showing up now, but I'll check in a second if there is anything. And next week's topic is back to more ADHD central, and it's what to do regarding the ongoing Adderall shortage. That's all. Have a healthy, happy week, and bye for now.